Okay, in the next three videos we're going to be looking at what is meant by material and non-material living standards, and then having a look at how a range of different factors can influence our material and non-material living standards. So in terms of the study guide, you need to be aware, and these are directly from the study guide, you need to be able to articulate the difference between material and non-material living standards, and we also need to explain how certain factors like access to goods and services, environmental quality, physical and mental health, people's life expectancy, crime rates and literacy rates, how all of these can influence both our material and non-material living standards. So as we go through these videos, make sure you're sort of starting to think about how each of these individual factors can impact our both material and non-material living standards. So in terms of material and non-material living standards, basically, material living standards is about the real value of goods and services that is produced each year. So a country, basically, their real GDP is a measure of the real value of their production every single year, and that determines people's access to goods and services because that's what determines people's income. So when the economy gets bigger, assuming that our real GDP grows at a faster rate than our population, then that's going to lead to people having increased purchasing power, and boosting our material living standards. So things like inflation and employment can also impact our material living standards. Inflation reduces our purchasing power, and employment allows people to have access to a disposable income and therefore generate more wealth. In terms of non-material living standards, we're talking about quality of life factors. So that can include things like happiness, environmental quality, whether you're satisfied with your job, the amount of leisure time that you have, how safe you are in your community, whether you have a voice in the community, and things like overcrowding and things like that as well. So in terms of definitions, material living standards, okay, make sure that you mention the term GDP per capita in your answers. So material living standards refer to the ability of individuals to access goods and services, most commonly measured by increases in GDP per capita or income per person. That's the main way we measure material living standards, not real GDP, because once we've got it divided by the size of the population to see the average income per person. So basically, it's assumed that utility or welfare is maximised if an economy produces a greater value of goods and services. So even though we generally get less satisfaction the more we produce or consume, our overall utility will generally grow the more we produce. So production of goods and services allows for increased jobs, it boosts incomes and boosts people's purchasing power. So make sure you've got a really tight, clear definition of material living standards. Non-material living standards, basically, they're all the things that affect our quality of life besides material possessions. So they're other quality of life factors. That's the best way to describe them, other quality of life factors. And basically they're a measure of the overall quality of life, including a range of hard-to-measure factors that influence happiness and life satisfaction. So this can include relationships, health, stress levels, congestion, quality of air. Make sure, I know it sounds simple, but make sure you do define this properly and say terms like quality of life factors, provide examples when you get asked questions about living standards, because it's really important that you have a holistic definition. In terms of access to goods and services, so the main measure of material living standards is determined by the country's level of GDP, and that indicates the total value of production. We use real GDP because we want to take out the impacts of price changes, because some of the increase in GDP may have been caused by price. So we want to see if the actual volume of goods and services produced has increased, and that will give us the best indication of whether our material living standards have increased. Real GDP is an increase in economic growth after taking out the impacts of inflation. So an increase in real GDP means that more goods and services have been produced than the year before, which generally means greater income and greater expenditure. So once we take out the inflationary figure, that's the figure that we use to work out whether our material living standards have increased. Note, real GDP is divided by the population to get real GDP per capita. Then real GDP per capita, if real GDP per capita increases, it means that incomes per person have increased and people can afford more goods and services after we take out the effects of inflation. Access to goods and services. So real GDP per capita is used to compare living standards between countries. In Australia, over the last 50 years, real GDP per capita has increased. So basically, incomes have grown faster than inflation. And that means that more people can purchase goods and services. More people can purchase more goods and services on average, or our purchasing power has increased. An increase in GDP per capita is also important because if people have got more income, it leads to additional spending, and therefore that can lead to reduced unemployment. So the increase in GDP per capita means there's more income per person, which then as a byproduct flows on to the fact that there is more spending in the economy and less unemployment. The main factors that help to boost a country's GDP. So the best way that we can boost our GDP are sort of supply side things. So boosting productivity, which can come about through better technology, or by increasing participation in the workforce. Because if more people are participating in the workforce, what that leads to is more people generating a factor income, and therefore helps to boost growth and allows us to produce more goods and services. So in order to reduce unemployment, we need to sustain strong rates of economic growth to boost GDP per capita and therefore boost people's purchasing power. Problems with real GDP per capita, it's not a perfect measure of our living standards. It doesn't tell us anything about how evenly wealth is distributed among society. Some people can have a lot of access to goods and services, have a high GDP per capita. Others can have a low because it's just an average. Other weaknesses is that some people produce their own goods and services. So if the people that grow their own fruit or grow their own produce are not included within economic activity because it's classified as non-marketed production, so that doesn't count in our GDP figures. Some people purchase goods and services in the black market, so a lot of people generate a high income, but they don't record that income because they might be selling illegal goods and services. Some people receive goods and services from charity, so their purchasing power might be quite high and they can afford to buy a fair few things, but because they're getting them for cheap or they're getting them for free from charities. So there's some weaknesses with terms of real GDP per capita as measuring our access to goods and services. So real GDP per capita is unreliable, but it's still a good estimate of people's access to goods and services. In terms of the impact growth has on non-material living standards, there's both positives and negatives. So an increase in material living standards can actually harm our non-material living standards, particularly if people get caught up in affluenza. So affluenza is the idea that we're continually trying to fulfill our wants over and over again. So it's the addictive pursuit of more goods and services, which can lead to us never being satisfied and can affect our mental health because we can never satisfy our desires. So the idea is that we want to achieve satisfaction from internal rather than external sources, but often people get overcome by this idea of affluenza and wanting more and more and more, and they're never satisfied, and that can lead to reduced non-material living standards. Higher material living standards have also led to more congestion as more people go to work on the roads. Depression rates have increased over the last 50 years despite the increase in GDP per capita. And as we produce more goods and services, we've got the negative externalities that can hurt the environment as well. So there are also positives as well in terms of our non-material living standards. So when people have higher income, it makes it easier for them to afford psychology services. So that might be able to improve their mental health and quality of life. But on the flip side, I mean, this is a bit random, but people with higher material living standards are also have got increased purchasing power to smoke, which could hurt the non-material living standards of others because they have to breathe in through passive smoking. Thank you.